Can I start by outlining the big picture in this case for my lady Moses? And it's this. There was a very well-known issue with the compatibility of cochlear implants and scanning patients in an MRI where there is a large magnetic field. And the problem was this. Although the external part of the device can obviously be removed, the implanted part remains embedded in the side of the patient's head, even though the device is not in use. And the device contained a thin disc-shaped magnet, the attraction to which is the means of attaching the external part to the outside of the head. And the magnetic dipole of those implanted magnets points directly outwards from the side of the head. And the incompatibility issue is the torque that those magnets experience when the patient is undergoing an MRI scan, subject to a high magnetic field. That field is generally in the head-to-toe direction, and the strongest they experience is up to 3 Teslas, which my lady and my lords may remember. A Tesla is one of those physical units where just 1 or 2 is in fact very large indeed. And the issue is the magnet with its dipole directed perpendicular to the field experiences a rotating force or torque, bigger in bigger fields, that tends to rotate the magnet. And where it's a flat disc shape lying just under the skin, it tends to rotate it in a way that one edge presses into the head and the other outwards. The shape and the orientation of that magnet is such that it experiences a twist to both dig into and pop out of the head at the same time. And the prior art relied upon in this case, another proposal from my client 7 years before the priority date in the patent in suit, proposed overcoming this torque issue by adopting magnets which were shaped so as to be able to temporarily rotate their dipole away from this problematic orientation when the implant is subject to a large magnetic field. And of course it's the same magnetic field and torque that causes the rotation in the proposed Zimmerling solution. It's the same one that causes the problem. But in Zimmerling, the prior art, the magnet remains one which is ordinarily, with its dipole facing out, keep raising a bit like horns coming directly out the side of the head, so that when in use, the magnetic attachment with the external component is the same as it was in the previous designs. And that's basically with a single north pole facing outwards, attracting a south pole on the external component, or vice versa. It could be a south pole attracting a north pole, but it's a single pole. And the proposal was to allow that to rotate away from that orientation when the external component is detached and the patient was placed in an MRI by providing a magnetic body with a different shape. And we'll come to it in more detail, but at this stage it suffices to note that the numerous illustrated examples were all spheres, in one case a plurality of spheres, save for one further example which was a cylinder. And Zimmerling is not specific to the particular shape to accommodate rotation. One might imagine other shapes that might do, so long as they are shaped to accommodate that rotation. Perhaps, say, a rugby ball shape or something like that. But the point of the Zimmerling proposal is to allow temporary rotation movement when in the MRI to move to more closely align that dipole that ordinarily sticks directly out perpendicular to the side of the head. You want to align it with the head-to-toe direction of the field. Something that the flat disc obviously wouldn't do because it's trying to push into the head. Now the patent, some 7 years later, had the insight to instead change the direction of the dipole. So instead of having it ordinarily perpendicular to the side of the head, whereby you attach with a single pole on the external magnet, you change the direction of the dipole from perpendicular to the side of the head to parallel with it. And I'll explain that that changes significantly the mode of attachment of the two magnets. I'll come on to explain how that changes. But it proposed doing that instead of changing the shape of the magnet. So one orients the magnet so its dipole is always in the plane of the side of the head. So the dipole is always oriented parallel to the side of the head instead of the problematic perpendicular orientation. And that fundamentally changes, as I've just foreshadowed, the mode of the magnetic attachment between the external component and the implant. Instead of it being a single north pole or south pole being presented to the outside world to attract a single but opposite pole in the external component, we now have both pairs of poles presented to the outside of the head, which means that it needs to be rotationally oriented with the magnet aligning parallel to the outside of the head in the external component as well. So to correctly attach and attract in this new orientation, you've got both poles, which means you need to line them up, which means rotational, correct rotational alignment. But to put it simply, one moves the mode of attachment from the mode of attachment that we show in our skeleton, which if my lady and my lords have it, it's paragraph 43, or between 43 and 44, on page 43 of the core bundle. Put it simply, one moves the mode of attachment from the left-hand side to what's shown in the right-hand side. The skin is shown as a dotted line here. Actually, horizontally, it might have been better to have it oriented vertically, but my lady and my lords get the point. And the conventional arrangement of the attachment is on the left-hand side, and one changes it to be that on the right-hand side. These are two figures taken from the patent, which we've coloured up in a way to illustrate north and south in the way that the judge does in some of his diagrams. The right-hand one is part of figure 4, it's not the entirety of it, but that's where we've got it from. And so when you do that, you redefine the issue. Instead of changing the shape of the conventional magnet as the prior art taught, to allow temporary rotation away from that problematic orientation, you change the dipole direction when in use. But as I say, that changes the nature of the attachment. Now, I'll obviously explain in more detail this precise proposal in Zimmerling, but that's the big picture of technically what's happening. And the big picture of what we say, how the judge went wrong in this case, by falling into error, is that in substance we see in cases of obviousness over common general knowledge alone warnings about only taking a partial picture, stripping away context, purpose and so forth. And that same point is the heart of the dispute here. At its heart, it's a point on hindsight. It's a point about identifying a starting point which has only a partial picture, and it's identified at a level of generality which is not the way in which skilled people actually see things in real life. And this particular species of hindsight infection is isolating a feature or features at a level of abstraction stripped of important context or other detail in which they are deployed. And my lady and my lords will appreciate context and technical purpose are absolutely key in patent law. Together with language, they make up what one might say are the holy trinity of what we deal with within. And this particular species of hindsight involves stripping out context and stripping out technical purpose so as to be able to deploy the abstract thing identified in a quite different context for a quite different purpose. And you'll appreciate that we submit that the principle is not limited to cases of obviousness over common general knowledge alone. One can fall foul of it in the context of an obviousness case based upon a particular piece of prior art. Hindsight can be deployed in isolating so-called teaching from a document at a level of generality that strips it of important context and technical purpose, so as to then deploy that abstract thing in a totally different context for a totally different purpose. And I'll come on and briefly address the key cases shortly, but at this stage, I simply draw attention to the fact that I don't detect on the other side any disagreement with the proposition that the principle that we see identified in the cases where the attack is based upon common general knowledge alone is not limited to common general knowledge alone cases. Don't detect that they take any dispute with that. We say it's applicable generally, and in particular it's applicable to an obviousness case over a particular piece of prior art. In this case, my friend disputes that that's what's happened, but I don't detect that he disputes that that principle isn't a more general application, and that if it does happen, it's an error of principle. At this stage on the big picture, can I just flag up one more, we say, very notable feature of the obviousness case? And that's the fact that my friend eschews any case that the skilled person looking at the art would take as a starting point and pursue any of the numerous proposed embodiments, even as a starting point with further modification. He's not interested in any of them, and there are lots of them. And the reason I'm drawing attention to that is I say that's pretty indicative, not conclusive. There may be special circumstances as to why you do it, but it's pretty indicative that he's wanting to avoid the detail of what Zimmerling is dealing with and how it's dealing with it. That was the case the judge was persuaded to accept, because he identified something at a very high level of abstraction as the so-called solution put forward by Zimmerling. Basically, it's simply the fact that implant magnets can rotate to align with an external magnetic field. That's how it was put in paragraph 206 of the judgment. They can rotate. Forget all the detail and context of the embodiments. Forget that all of them keep the conventional arrangement of the magnetic dipole pointing out perpendicularly from the side of the head. Forget that where there is rotation, it is introduced by a modification in shape to accommodate rotation. And forget that it's done to enable the magnet to conveniently rotate temporarily to align with an external field, but then to return to that perpendicular orientation afterwards. Forget all of that. Simply think about the much more general abstract idea of implant magnets being able to rotate to align with an external magnetic field. That's the essence of the case. And my lady and my lords will see, I hope, why we say it's falling into the same error of isolating something from its context and purpose, just as the cases of attacks based upon common general knowledge alone warn against. And let me add this. Why is it done? It's being done because it's necessary to have an artificial starting point, affected by hindsight, stripped of all of this inconvenient detail. The context and purpose. That is why it's done. That is why going to that very high level of abstraction is done to give an artificial starting point, which then can be just deployed for a different purpose in a different way. And my lady and my lord should note that it's not just my submission that this approach is flawed. I'll come to it in due course, but substantially the same case was advanced and rejected in Europe in the TBA of the EPO, and it was done by identifying that Zimmerling was about more than that abstract idea. It was done by identifying the things that Zimmerling was concerned with, changing shape, keeping the dipole as ordinarily oriented. The things that I say have been stripped out so as to extract something at an unnatural and artificial level of abstraction. Now, my lady and my lords, there's another aspect of the judgment where we say the judge also went wrong, and that's his requirement that all three players in the market needed to be shown to have been aware of Zimmerling for the secondary factor of why wasn't the problem not solved before to have any weight. It is, I accept, a secondary factor, so I don't overplay the point, but the judge did get that wrong as a point of principle 2, requiring everyone to be shown to be well aware of it, as I shall elaborate in due course. So that's the big picture. Can I tell my lady and my lords where I intend to go for the rest of my submissions before embarking on the detail? First, I'm going to very briefly address the law on hindsight and isolating teaching out of context. That will be very quick. Then I will outline the key aspects of common general knowledge and some of the basic preliminary matters that my lady and my lords need to have a handle on. Next, I'll turn to Zimmerling itself. Then I will address how the judge dealt with Zimmerling. These two Zimmerling sections are, of course, key because Zimmerling and its treatment by the judge is at the heart of my criticisms of the judge. And I'll then explain how that led the judge into error in his analysis. As I address these sections, I will pick up what I see as my friend's answers to our points as he set them out in his skeleton. Then I'm going to come on and address that secondary issue of long-felt want and the error the judge made there. Finally, there's the issue of infringement, which the judge actually determined in my client's favour on the claim as it stood before him. The issue has been complicated by an amendment that's taken place in the EPO, something that doesn't affect the obviousness arguments. When I'll get there, I'll explain the scope of the dispute, which is fortunately fairly narrow. It's the final issue I'll turn to.
Mr. Speck, just before you continue, we would like to hear from you both on the first issue first, on the obviousness issue, and then we'd like to have heard from you both by 12 o'clock tomorrow, just so that you know how to plan your submissions.
Right.
And then on infringement.
Certainly, 12 o'clock might be...
Treat it as a target, not a deadline.
Yes, okay, I understand. But that includes the long-felt want point.
Yes.
Certainly. Can I turn to the law? We've given my lady and my lords the well-known case of IPCOM in paragraph 16 of our skeleton concerning hindsight generally. And we've also set out the quote of Mr. Justice Floyd, as he then was in the ratio farm case, as to this particular problem in common general knowledge only cases where a partial picture is presented by avoiding context. And the warning, which we see set out the whole text in paragraph 17 of our skeleton, is given in the context of a tax based on common general knowledge alone. But as I've already foreshadowed, we say it's applicable more generally. It's a very well-known warning now, So we've not included it separately in the authorities bundle, we just set it out there. And the substance of the point is that one shouldn't proceed on a partial picture. You need the whole picture. And as I've already foreshadowed to my lady, my lords, what I say that is in effect saying that you shouldn't have an artificial starting point for the obviousness assessment. That's what a partial picture is. And things parties attacking patents like to do is to strip out directions or context that are not helpful. And as I have said, we say that that's a more general application. Applies to a case based upon a publication itself. You still need the full picture, not a partial one. And as I say, as I already said, I don't actually detect that the submission I make to my lady and my lords about the law and the principle is disputed. The fight is whether it's happened in this case. The fight is whether that's happened, looking at the judgment and the disclosure of Zimmerling. So that's all I wanted to say about that point of principle on the law. Can I move to the basics of the common general knowledge? I'll be making reference to parts of the judgment, so if you have Core Bundle tab 7 open, it will be convenient. Can I just outline some of the things that we say are important? By the priority date, 2010, there were just 3 main producers, 2 parties to this litigation, AB and MED-EL, and the third, a company called Cochlear, as the judge explained in paragraph 50, towards the end of that paragraph. And the design of their products had, in the judge's word, in paragraph 51, converged, meaning they're basically all the same, into a flat, thin, planar coil housing. The whole product, as I've already foreshadowed, is made up of 2 parts, the implant part and the external part that attaches to the outside of the head. The external part has the microphone and the transmitter coil to transmit the signal to the implant. The implant itself has 2 main elements. First, the bit which houses the receiver coil and the implanted permanent magnet. And secondly, a section with the electronics. And they are the left and right hand side, respectively, of the diagram that you see the judge set out in paragraph 51. They're about the same thickness, i.e. pretty thin, and typically very slightly angled between them, as shown in the diagram, to conform to the slight curvature of the head, but broadly they're flat against the side of the head. And that part is implanted on the side of the head, just under the skin, and that's why it's designed to be thin. And when the product's in use, so that's when the external component is attached to the side of the head, the external part is held in position by a magnet in the external part, which lines up and attaches so that the transmitter and receiver coils in the 2 parts are coincident and it's held on. And the magnet is in the centre of that round part in the figure on para 51. That round part on the left-hand side, you see this small circular bit in the middle, that's the magnet. The coil goes around the outside of it. And we're particularly concerned with that part of the implant containing the magnet and the receiver coil, and in particular the method of attachment to the external part. When it's not in use, the external part can obviously be taken away, but the implant is still under the skin, can't be removed without surgery, and because it contains one of those 2 magnets, it suffers from the very well-known problem that I've already highlighted to my lady and my lords when the MRI scanner is used on a patient, due to the very high fields that you have in MRIs. There were other issues with MRIs of lesser concern, such as worries about the magnet demagnetising and artifacts on the image and so forth. But the main issue, described as such in paragraph 59 of the judgment, 3 lines from the foot of page 92 of the core bundle, was what, like the judge, I will call the tort problem. Now, the compatibility with MRIs was so well known that it was one of the design drivers for manufacturers. The judge describes the design drivers that directly relate to hearing performance as primary drivers and identified the MRI compatibility as a secondary design driver. My friend, I think, seeks to rely upon that perfectly natural way to characterise a concern that's not directly related to hearing performance as in some way diminishing the importance of the issue. We say the key finding is that the issue was not just the main issue with MRIs, but it was common general knowledge, as the judge held at the end of paragraph 59 on the top of page 93. So this problem is a common general knowledge problem. And indeed it was addressed by pretty extreme measures, the first of which was surgery, either to remove the entire device or just the magnets if they'd been designed to be individually removable. And that's done before an MRI scan. As you can see, the judge identifies at para 61. In fact, it obviously requires surgery twice because you've then got to put them back again. And as the judge holds at the end of 61, surgery is to be avoided if possible, so not at all satisfactory. The other approach, other than simply not scanning with an MRI at all, was tight head wrapping to reduce the risk of pain and discomfort. The judge records that at 62, and that it was part of the common general knowledge. So, my lady, my lords, that's the problem. It's a common general knowledge problem, and those are the ways of dealing with it. Can I just explain the problem itself in a little more detail by considering the patient lying in the MRI in the way that the patent and indeed Zimmerling illustrate the problem. They illustrate it with reference to figure 2 in both of their illustrations. What you need to understand, first of all, is the nature of the magnetisation of the magnet, which we've reproduced at paragraph 20 of our skeleton.
Well, since we're in the judgment, we've got it at paragraph 44.
That, exactly, yes, it's there as well. And it's a disc where the top is shaded green and the bottom red. That's not to suggest there's 2 different materials or 2 different pieces. It's all one thing, but magnetised with a north pole facing upwards and a south pole downwards in this depiction. And the green is just intended to show the half of it, which is the north end, and the red, the south end. And the polarity is shown by the arrow also included. It's a vector quantity. And as I've already foreshadowed, just to be clear, in use, when the external component is attached to the head, if the green surface is the outwardly facing surface, the north pole faces outwards, the inward facing surface of the magnet is the red surface, or the south pole. And as I've also already foreshadowed, that is in substance what we've done by colouring in the equivalent of figure 1 in the patent on the left-hand side of our paragraph 43, so that you can see the same notation, the green and red notation used to show how the magnet is oriented. And if we look in the judgment at page 90, sorry, paragraph, yeah, no, page 90 of the core bundle, we see what is in effect a depiction of the problem that I've tried to explain to my lady and my lords by actually showing the vectors. And here what we see is the skin, the side of the head shown vertically, the dotted line. The disc-shaped magnet is shown parallel to the side of the head. It's a bit like a coin stood on its rim. And you see the arrow marked magnetisation pointing left, so directly out the side of the head. And the magnetisation of the external field is head to toe, so down the page. And the effect is that there is a torque or turning force shown here such that the top edge will tend to press outwards, and it's the bottom edge that's tending to press inwards. And it's a physical law, I hope my lady and my lords have grasped that, just one of the laws of physics, that a magnet experiences this torque in an external field, and it will tend to rotate to align its dipole with the external field. Important, it's just a rule of physics, a basic rule of physics, that's what happens. And the reason I'm highlighting that it's a basic rule of physics, because it's basically the judges identifying the same thing, that magnets rotate, can rotate in a magnetic field, as the principle to be taken from the Zimmerling prior art, which is its solution. That again is an indicator that we're going to far too high an abstraction, because it's both the cause of the problem and the solution, the judge's way of looking at it. Now, there are here, there's an axis of the magnetic dipole, and there is an axis of symmetry that you don't see in this diagram, but which is directly down through the axis of the disc itself, which coincides with the magnetic dipole in this case. So there are two axes there which happen to coincide. Now, there are in fact three axes or conceptual axes that I want my lady and my lords to have a handle on, and it's really important that you do. And I want to just pause and explain what they are before we go any further. And we have to do that because there is some confusion in my friend's skeleton when he talks about axes or axes of rotation. He doesn't mean the same thing every time. And I want to try to make sure that my lady and my lords have got a handle on each of the three things that we will talk about. First is this. A volume of material, a three-dimensional shape if you will, may have an axis of rotational symmetry. It's not specific to magnets. Any three-dimensional shape may have an axis of rotational symmetry. And I'm going to be using the term axis of symmetry or axis of rotational symmetry to mean an axis which is an axis that you can rotate the shape around without changing the space it occupies. So for example, a disc, say a pound coin, has an axis of symmetry through the centre of its faces, perpendicular to those faces. And if we turn the coin about that axis, rotating it like a wheel, it moves only in the sense that it rotates, but no part of it moves to occupy space that was not previously occupied. Put in another way, it doesn't disturb its surroundings at all when it rotates. Now, a rod or a cylinder will have an axis of rotational symmetry down its centre line. So the lead in the pencil is along an axis of rotational symmetry. The axis of symmetry is a property of the body itself, in particular its geometry. The next thing that I want my lady and my lords to have a handle on is that one can rotate a body about any axis. That's true of a body that has no symmetry at all. I can rotate a Mickey Mouse shape about an axis I choose, for example. And the axis about which I rotate it, so its axis of rotation, is not a property of the body itself, but a feature of how it's moving at a particular time. Rotating a disc, that coin shape, can be done about its axis of symmetry, as I've explained, but also if you stand it on its end and spin it about a vertical axis, it spins in effect through a volume of space which is a sphere, and bits of it move into space which was not previously occupied as it goes round. Taking my rod or pencil, I can rotate that like a roller about its axis of symmetry, where it doesn't disturb its surroundings, or I can rotate it like a propeller about an axis perpendicularly upwards when it does move through its surroundings. And that's how it moves in an example my friend likes to refer to, the magnetic lab stirrer. In the propeller, or the lab stirrer examples, the axis of rotation is perpendicular to the axis of symmetry. You positively want to disrupt the surroundings, to stir the liquid. So you don't rotate it about an axis of symmetry like a roller, you rotate it about an axis that is perpendicular, like a propeller. And a sphere is a special case where it has many axes of symmetry, and rotating about any axis that goes through its centre point is rotation about an axis of symmetry. It doesn't ever, when you rotate about any of those axes, rotate into a part of the space not previously occupied. So the difference between an axis of symmetry and an axis of actual rotation is that the axis of rotation is a property of how it is actually rotating at that point in time, and it need not be an axis of symmetry. And the third thing we need to have in mind is the axis or direction of magnetisation. That is a property of a magnetised body, so not dependent upon movement at a particular time, but unlike the axis of symmetry, it's not dependent on its geometry. Any body that can be magnetised in any direction, and as I say, it can even be a body that has no symmetry at all. A Mickey Mouse shaped body can be magnetised and still have a dipole that has a direction. And my friend emphasises that magnets were known to be available to be magnetised in any direction. That is accepted on my side, and in fact we rely upon it too. Despite it being well known that the direction of magnetisation can be whatever one pleases, there was not a hint anywhere that one would change the direction of the magnetic dipole in the attachment of a cochlear implant away from the simple arrangement that had a single pole which pointed directly out of the side of the head. The case is not about availability or knowledge of availability of specific kinds of magnets. It's about thinking of the change of the direction of the dipole one wants to use in the first place. Now, I've spent some time explaining these three axes which are distinct, and in particular the one that I really want my lady and my lords to keep an eye on is that difference between an axis of symmetry and an axis of rotation, because my friend muddles them up. He speaks, quotes, of a diametric direction to the magnetic dipole, and sometimes he means this to mean a magnet with a direction of magnetisation across the diameter of a circular cross-section. So he means it to mean something about direction relative to geometry. Sometimes he talks about it as meaning across an axis of actual rotation. And that's when he refers to his magnetic stirrer. And he mulls them up and tries to make my lady and my lords think he's talking about the same concept each time. And he's not. You've got to be very careful about what he's saying. As I say, that's how he brings the magnetic lab stirrer in. We'll come to it. But there, the axis of rotation is not an axis of symmetry at all. One's spinning a rod of a cylindrical shape like a propeller, deliberately to mix surroundings. It's magnetised across the axis of rotation, but that is in fact magnetised along an axis of symmetry. It is along the lead in the pencil. He's muddling it up, trying to say it's all the same thing, but it's not. I'm sorry to have to go into the detail, but in his treatment, as we'll come to, you have to be very careful about what he's saying. But of course, my lady and my lord shouldn't let any of this obscure the key thing, which is it is part of the laws of physics and actually the heart of the problem with which the patent is concerned, that magnets in an external field, unless they're already aligned with it, will tend to align with it because they will experience a torque. And there's no dispute about that. And of course, when they do experience that torque and they rotate, it is necessarily perpendicular to the dipole. Necessarily, because the laws of physics are that it's a vector cross product. But of course, the axis of rotation necessarily perpendicular to the dipole, but that axis of rotation is not necessarily an axis of symmetry, as my friend's own lab stirrer example illustrates. Before we leave the basics and the common general knowledge, can I look at what my friend has to say on the subject in their skeleton? They refer to our explanation in paragraph 11 of their skeleton and notably do not make any criticism of it. They say they've got a few additional points to add and one point of clarification. And there are 4 additional points made in the subparagraphs of paragraph 11. The first, subparagraph 1, is a point that the skilled person would know magnets could be made in any reasonable basic shape and magnetised in a variety of ways. Indeed, something, as I say, I rely upon. It isn't a case about availability of magnets, it's having the idea. The next point, subparagraph 2, I'm going to come back to because there's a bit more to say about that, and it relates to what I've just been talking about and bleeds into paragraph 12. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Subparagraph 3 refers to the convergence of the designs of all the players in the market. In fact, just 3, as I've explained. And that's something I've already touched upon. There's a little bit of spin inserted into this paragraph. It's true that the judge held simplicity would be preferred, although he explains that it's, as one would expect, a trade-off between simplicity and clinical benefit. And he also held that the length of regulatory approval process would be taken account of. But he doesn't hold that means they would want to keep changes to a minimum in paragraphs 50 to 55. That's my friend's submission as to the consequence. And he's putting it too highly if he's suggesting that, in effect, there's always a general reluctance to make changes. Subparagraph 4 is really a detail of the converged design covered in subparagraph 3, and it's referring to the designs utilising the disc-shaped axially magnetised magnets And here I understand he's talking about actually magnetised in the sense of magnetised along an axis of symmetry, not rotation. So it's the arrow shown in our diagram, the skeleton at paragraph 20. Now returning to subparagraph 2, this needs a little bit more care. The first sentence says that it was common general knowledge that a magnet magnetised across its axis could rotate when interacting with an external magnetic field. It just says its axis. The second sentence said this is the principle behind the magnetic stirrer in the lab. Those are devices one has a flask with chemical reagents you want to stir for a long time. You have a bar-shaped magnet that's popped into the bottom of the flask, lies horizontally across the diameter of the flask, and it's placed on a platform under which there's a rotating magnetic field. And the bar in the flask rotates like a propeller because the magnetic dipole is pulled around by the rotating magnetic field. Leave aside that it's different because you want it to go on forever, not just aligned to a static magnetic field. But what you're doing there is you positively want to disrupt the surroundings, and as I foreshadowed, what you're doing there is that you have a magnetisation along its axis of symmetry, but across its axis of rotation. You've got to be careful about what he's talking about there. And I was puzzled when I first saw that, but if you drop down to paragraph 12, because although he just says axis, if you drop down to paragraph 12, you can see he's talking about axis of rotation. So if you go down to the third line down over on the right-hand side, the axis he appears to be talking about here is axis of rotation. And he mentions the lab stirrer as in that example at the bottom of that page as well. But I have to say, it is all still pretty muddled because he also refers in the first couple of lines about a magnet being axially magnetised along its axis of rotation, referring to the patent. And there, he must be talking about an axis of rotational symmetry. With respect to my friend, it is a complete muddle. What he wants my lady and my lords to think is going on is the same thing each time, but it's not. It's not the same thing going on each time. And insofar as he's simply saying that a magnet magnetised in a particular way will rotate about an axis which is at right angles to that dipole, he is simply referring to the law of physics. Simply the law of physics, if that's all he's saying. Can we just go back up to subparagraph 2, because I haven't looked at the second sentence of that paragraph yet. And here we seem to be moving from a statement that something could rotate when in an external magnetic field to a suggestion that for there to be rotation, a magnet needs to be diametrically magnetised. Here we seem to be moving to a suggestion that it has to have a magnetisation with a particular orientation relative to the geometry of the body, that it has to be magnetised across a diameter of something with presumably a circular cross-section. If that is what is intended to be said there, it's both wrong and not supported by the cross-examination. The cross-examination referred to I'm not going to ask you to turn it up now, is simply, it's in the supplementary bundle, tab 24, page 225. It's simply an introductory part of the cross-examination about Zimmerling, which refers to the fact that a magnet will rotate to align with a magnetic field about 2 pages before the extract that my friend relies upon. There's not a whiff of any consideration of the direction of magnetisation, let alone any suggestion of a need for a specific type of magnetisation to achieve rotation. As explained, it simply happens in any event because it is a rule of physics. So it's quite painful, I'm afraid, looking at this page of my friend's skeleton. The upshot my lady and my lords have to be aware of. We say you have to be very careful about his submissions on this because he's muddling things up, and in particular he wants to refer to something being diametrically magnetised when he means perpendicular in one sense to a circular cross-section, so he's referring to geometry, and in another sense he just means perpendicular to an axis of rotation. Before I leave this section of my friend's skeleton, can I just touch on paragraph 15? Because it's worth looking at, because it rather makes a central point in the case for me. It's said to be a point of clarification, and it relates to our explanation about the known torque issue in the MRI, as we've described it in paragraph 24 of our skeleton. And that's where we explain that in the prior design, the torque that the magnetic dipole perpendicular to the side of the head experiences is such that it tends to rotate not about an axis of symmetry, but an axis across its diameter, so that it tends to press outwards on the upper part and inwards on the lower part, as I've explained to my lady and my lords already. It can't actually rotate as the torque is forcing it to, because it's shaped so that this movement involves moving into a volume of space not already occupied, so digging into the head and trying to pop out. And that means that the surroundings constrain the magnet by exerting an equal and opposite torque. My friend doesn't like our characterisation of this being a problem with shape, as you can see towards the end of paragraph 15 of his skeleton. It's said to be a problem because the magnet wants to align with the external magnetic field, but can't because of space limitation due to its position between skull and skin. Well, that sounds a lot like a problem with shape to me, but in any event, the thrust of this paragraph really highlights our point as to the invention redefining the problem. It's a problem with shape if one thinks of keeping the magnetic dipole oriented perpendicularly outwards, but accommodating an ability to temporarily rotate away when not in use and placed in the MRI. The shape doesn't allow it. That's the way you're thinking. It's a problem with shape. And that's really what they're saying when they say it can't rotate because of space limitation. And in Zimmerling, that's certainly what was addressed, a shape that allowed the magnetic dipole, which remained perpendicular to the head in use, but also to be temporarily rotated away when not in use, is what it did. But of course, it's not a problem with shape if you think differently and permanently rearrange the dipole so as not to be in that problematic orientation by changing the kind of magnetic attraction between the implant and the external component. If you don't think in terms of needing a single north pole facing outwards from the head to attract a single south pole, and think about having the dipole parallel to the side of the head, it's not a problem with shape. So I say my friends are making my point for me in this paragraph, it is a problem with shape with one mindset, but not in another. And the problem for my friend is there's nothing in the common general knowledge or in the prior art that he relies upon to give any hint at all to change the orientation of the magnet so that the dipole is just not in that problematic perpendicular orientation ever. The art they rely upon, it is viewed as something that is addressed by keeping that dipole in that orientation when you attach, and it's a problem addressed by modifying shape to allow that temporary rotation away, not by just changing the direction of the dipole in attachment. That's all I wanted to say about my friend's section on the common general knowledge itself. Can I move on and address the Zimmerling art, the document that's in the supplemental bundle? So if I could ask my lady and my lords to go to that bundle. And I'm obviously going to look at the detail of this in some detail with my lady and my lords, because you'll understand that my appeal is focused on the judge's treatment of this document. And we deal with it in our skeleton from para 26 onwards. The document's in tab 4. And before we get into the detail, can I just flag up what I say you need to keep an eye on before we get into the detail? And really what I'm doing is flagging up the points that we make in the section beginning in paragraph 38, which of our skeleton, which is under the heading Zimmerling overall. And the first and really key point is something that I've already foreshadowed pretty extensively already. Many of the embodiments utilise the idea of making the magnet a shape such that it can be provided within housing with freedom to rotate its dipole away from the position that it's intended to take in use. There are some embodiments that have no rotation at all, we'll see those, but those that do have rotation are all rotating for that purpose, to temporarily move the dipole from that conventional orientation sticking perpendicularly out of the side of the head, which it takes when it's attaching to the external component. And I'd say this as well, in all cases, all embodiments, even those not concerned with rotation, they use the dipole in that conventional orientation when attaching. So it's universal throughout Zimmerling. You don't mess with the mode of attachment, even those that are not directed to rotation at all. And so the attachment magnet on the outside component is also the same in all cases as the conventional device. So it's one that presents a single pole to the side of the head. Next point, what Zimmerling proposes in the embodiments that do have rotation is to modify the shape of the magnet to allow it to temporarily rotate away from that in-use orientation, when of course the external component is not there, so it doesn't have to be in that orientation. My lady, my lord should note that in some embodiments it also uses this rotational movement to provide switching functionality. And to be clear, there's no clear distinction between rotating embodiments and switching, as the judge seemed to indicate. Not true at all. The way switching is achieved is through the movement of rotation. Next point that I make is Zimmerling is not limited to any particular shape. We don't suggest that it is. But does give both examples and guidance on what is needed about shape. And it is basically thinness of rotational profile. The examples of the shapes that rotate are actually all spheres, as I've said. In one case, a multiplicity of them, to give an even thinner profile for the same volume of magnetic material, save for one, which is a cylinder that rotates like a roller, not like a propeller, like a roller, which in fact also has switching functionality built in. So the general idea is not limited to a particular shape, or even, I'd accept it's not limited to the precise illustrated examples. That is a straw man that my friend seeks to put up to present my lady and my lords with a false dichotomy. He wants to suggest that my lady and my lords must conclude it's either limited to specific shapes or to say that it's not concerned with shape at all. But it is. It's concerned with shape, and that is the means by which the temporary rotation away from the problematic perpendicular direction is accomplished. And when we get to it, we'll see that was recognised by the TBA in the EPO 2. So those are the big pictures that I want, or the issues that I want my lady and my lords to have in mind when we go through looking at some of the detail. Can we look at some of the detail so I can make those points good? It's Supplemental Bundle tab 4, and as you can see from its first page, which is bundle page 28, around about line 21, it's concerned with the torque problem. See, torque is mentioned by reference to figure 2, which is on page 52 of the bundle, and it's the figure we've seen in the judgment and is in fact the same figure that's also reproduced as figure 2 in the patent suit. We see down the rest of the text on page 28 that it's also concerned with other effects of MRI, including inducing voltages, which is, just as an aside, why it's concerned with things like switching to isolate parts of the electronics. If we drop down to the summary, so now at page 29 of the bundle, that introduces the first embodiment, which is said to be a magnetic switch. It has magnetically soft body. That's something which can be very temporarily induced to be a magnet. And this is in fact a high-level description of what we see in figures 8 and 9, which you can see if you go forward to page 55 and 56. It's either a rotatable sphere or cylinder with this soft magnetic body as a kind of cap that's either attracted down or repulsed up, depending on the direction of the field. And if it's up, my lady and my lords can see more clearly looking at figure 8, there are some contacts at the top. So if you look at the difference of the positioning of the soft magnetic cap between figure 8B and figure 8C, when it's in the up position, it completes the circuit, so the switch is on, and when it drops down, it's not. So that's the way that works. If we go back to the summary, so page 3 of the document, page 30 of the bundle, another embodiment is introduced at line 14. It's identified here as an implant including a housing, and it goes on to say at least one magnet is free to turn in the housing such that at least one magnet is capable of lining at least partially with the external magnetic field. And I'm particularly drawing attention to that, and my lady and my lord should note that, because my friend relies upon that half sentence in his skeleton at paragraph 18. He says the same thing is mentioned elsewhere. I hope I'm not being unfair to him when I suggest I think he's really relying upon it here, because he suggests the same point is made page 2 of the document, line 29 to 33, but that's concerned with the magnetic switch, which I thought he was suggesting was an aspect to be ignored. And he also says it's repeated at lines 25 to 27 of page 3, but that doesn't seem to be right. But it is there in the place that I've just shown you, so I think that's really where he's relying upon it. But my lady and my lords will understand plucking that half sentence or sentence out without looking at what's actually described is actually the vice that I'm complaining on. The text relating to this goes on and suggests that the magnet may be spherical or cylindrical, line 26, or that a plurality of spherical shaped magnets may be used. And that's foreshadowing what we see in figure 4. So it is telling you the kind of thing that's necessary, and what it's describing is the kind of thing by reference to its shape. Now, I think I can move forward and pick up the teaching relating to the specific figures, which starts on page 34 of the bundle. And the first figure referred to is figure 3. And that can be seen on page 52 of the bundle. It's the most general introductory figure. It's housing within which a magnet turns, and it's described at page 34 of the bundle, line 21. And we're going to this because the text here includes a sentence my friend relies upon, to the effect that housing 303 allows the implanted magnet of whatever shape to turn, possibly with some restrictions, into the external magnetic field lines. So this is line 27 to 29 of page 34. The space it provides is clearly spherical, but one could have shapes in which not the whole of that space is wholly filled. Perhaps you could fill cutaways with more lubrication, which my lady and my lords will note is also included as mentioned in the text at the top of page 35 of the bundle. What's actually shown is a spherical magnet inside the housing, as is explained at the top of the page. And my friend relies upon that text where it says whatever shape to turn to suggest that Zimmerling is not concerned with shape at all. But as I say, you see from the thrust of what it's proposing that it is concerned with shape, it's just not concerned with only one or only two shapes. It is concerned, it's proposing a way of improving the common general knowledge design by modifying the shape of the magnet to allow it to temporarily rotate its dipole away from the problematic orientation. As to which the text at the top of page 35 goes on at line 6 to suggest instead of a sphere, it may be a variety of shapes. Note that it doesn't say any shape will do, simply that there are a variety, and the kind of thing contemplated is appreciated by the suggestion of a cylinder that can rotate about its axis. So that means a cylinder to rotate in the sense of rotating like a roller. Rotating like a roller, not a propeller. And at line 8, for instance, it explains the magnetization that the cylinder carries for this is normal to its axis. And we can see from the explanation that it will be arranged horizontally parallel to the skin, so that's flat lengthways parallel to the skin. And the dipole is obviously perpendicular to that, which means it's able to be oriented perpendicular to the side of the head, so it attaches in the ordinary way, but also temporarily to rotate so as to align with the head to toe direction, or to use the words of Zimmerling, the direction of the patient's axis. You see that explanation from line 8 through to 13 on page 35, where it refers to the patient's axis. That's the head-to-toe direction. There's then proposed a slightly different arrangement. This is from line 14, where the same cylinder is implanted at an angle of 45 degrees off the horizontal on the side of the head. And that's so as to be able to partially adjust to a different type of lower field MRI that actually uses a vertical field. It's an open bore machine where you lie in it and basically the field goes from the front of your face through to the back of your head. They're lower field devices, and the point of having a 45-degree alignment is it provides the ability to partially align with fields in either direction rather than fully in one direction. Of course, in both cases, when the external magnet is removed, when they remove from the MRI, it goes back to pointing out directly perpendicular to the side of the head for the attachment. Now, the cylinder magnet is said to have a better aspect ratio than the sphere. That's the diameter versus length. This is page 8 of the document, page 35 of the bundle, lines 16 to 19. So for a given volume of magnetic material, one can have a thinner profile. And it's obviously suggesting that this is regarded as advantageous over a sphere. And you should note this, please, because it wouldn't be saying this if Zimmerling was not concerned with shape. It's telling you, as between the two shapes that it is proposing, the cylinder has this advantageous property. And that's because what it's concerned with is thinness of rotational profile, and the desirability of a thinner profile continues to be the document's focus as it turns to figure 4 from line 20 onwards on page 35 of the bundle. And we can see from the figure itself, on page 53, it comprises 3 separate spherical magnets instead of just one. And again, that allows for a thinner design and a thinner profile in which the magnetic elements rotate for a given amount of magnetic material. You have 3 spheres arranged like this. Obviously, it's thinner in depth than one single sphere with the same volume of material. Again, though, if you look at figure 4b, you see the conventional arrangement of the dipole when in attachment mode. The external magnet is shown, and it's completely conventional, with the dipole in the implant being directed perpendicularly out of the head.
Presumably that only happens when you put the external magnet beside the balls so that they all line up.
I think it might depend on how far apart they are, but I understand what your lordship's saying. Your lordship's saying that they might kind of align themselves, almost point round in a circle. I think your lordship may be right about that. But when they're being used, it points outwards. But your lordship may be right. It depends on how close they are, but there is a possibility that it's not a perfect circle, but they kind of point round, depending on how many there are. But I agree with my lord.
Okay. Thank you.
Can we turn back to the text, page 36 of the bundle, and pick it up at line 3, where another embodiment is referred to as shown in figure 5. This is a magnet surrounded by magnetically soft material, and that shields the magnet from the external field, reducing the torque that it experiences and possible demagnetization. That's explained in the text, page 36 of the bundle, lines 6 to 7. But again, the magnet is itself a typical one. The disc-shaped magnet shown in that diagram side on. The text explains it's typically oriented and generates a magnetic field normal to the skin. That's lines 9 to 11 on page 36. Just as an aside, we referred to this in our skeleton, and there's a typo, unfortunately. In our paragraph 34 at the top of page 9, we referred to it as page, we were using internal pagination, and we said page 10, it should be page 9. But I draw attention to that, not because it's a rotation example, but it's an example, which in fact the judge referred to as well, where a different means of dealing with the torque problem was employed. In effect, it kind of sucks the magnetic field or part of it away from the magnet itself, but the magnet stays the conventional one. The attachment is the conventional dipole perpendicular to the side of the head. There are several more exotic or involved embodiments, but the means of attachment is always the same. There's use of something called ferrofluid, which is a liquid in which you've got tiny magnetic particles suspended in it. And there's other examples with magnetic soft material, various other details to achieve switching, such as pins or contacts. But it's always the same, my lady and my lords. We've got the same conventional attachment, and if we're ever rotating, we're rotating away from that so as to align with the field temporarily. It goes back to the ordinary way of attaching when you put the component, the external component, back on. I think I've shown, my lady and my lords, enough for you to see why I say what I have about the teaching of Zimmerling and the constant theme that it's always attached in the conventional way, and the rotation is to rotate away from that conventional way temporarily. What Zimmerling doesn't hint of is any change of the dipole arrangement in normal use, by which I mean when the external component is there, the means by which the attachment is achieved. Doesn't hint at changing that, such that the problematic orientation isn't there to start with. And that's key, because really that's at the heart of what happens when the judge deals with this, is that he extracts a point that is so abstract as to really be no more than the physical law, and then is looking at it as if it's suggesting you can do any form of rotating magnets for different purposes in a different context. But there isn't a hint of changing that conventional dipole arrangement in normal use. Can I just show you how the judge dealt with this? And it's really turning to the matters that we addressed in our skeleton from paragraph 53 onwards. And we're going to be going back to the judgment, or at least more often, so if my lady and my lords revert back to the core bundle in tab 7. And the first point I draw attention to is the fact that that para 196 of his judgment, the judge identifies what he says are two general concepts described within the specific embodiments. So he's talking about what you can distill from the specific embodiments. See the first sentence of 196. Two general concepts described within the specific embodiments. First, magnetic switch, which he says he's not set out because the experts wouldn't be very interested in it. And secondly, this is right at the foot of the page, there's second relates to at least one magnet is free to turn in the housing such that at least one magnet is capable of aligning partially with an external magnetic field. Not clear what the relates to language is intended to do other than simply identify the concept he's saying is described within the specific embodiments. But he's saying that one gleans this from the specific embodiment description. And of course, my lady and my lords understand my criticism of this, that it's way too high a level of generality if one is taking it to mean the skilled person would then consider all and any ways of providing a magnet free to rotate so that it's capable of lining with an external magnetic field as disclosed or even suggested. Way too high if that's what's being said, and as we'll see, that is the substance of what happens. More specifically, it's not hinting or suggesting of doing so for a reason other than in circumstances where one has the conventional perpendicular dipole in use, which is the problematic one in the MRI, perpendicularly out of the side of the head, and one's purpose is to provide a magnet with the ability to temporarily rotate away from that when not in use. That's just not hinted at. My lady and my lord should also note that the identification of the two general concepts is a rather incomplete picture. There are embodiments that do neither of these things. And in fact, the judge goes on to explain them without remarking they've got nothing to do what he said are the two general concepts. I have in mind figures 5 and 6 addressed in paragraphs 201 and 202 of the judgment. And my point in referring to this is not just to be pernickety about the accuracy of the judgment, but, as I think I've already foreshadowed, to draw attention to more important context, more of the same, the general point being that they depict, in all cases, magnets with the conventional direction of dipole in use. In this case, with other features proposed to make that otherwise problematic orientation more compatible with the MRI.
So, can I be clear, what is your criticism about paragraphs 201 and 202? Because given that he expressly describes these embodiments, you can't say he's ignored them.
No, I don't say
right,
that.
so what's wrong with those two paragraphs?
There's nothing wrong with those two paragraphs. It's the way in which he's describing the generality of what you see in the embodiments in 196. There's absolutely nothing wrong with those paragraphs. It's the fact that he doesn't really appear to note or realise that they've got nothing to do with what he says, the general teaching of the document that you get.
Okay.
But I do rely upon the existence of those embodiments, as I think I've already said, as further reinforcing what the document is all about, what it's contemplating, is the conventional mode of alignment, or mode of attachment of the magnets. It's further context that all Zimmerling is concerned with is the conventional mode of attachment. What can you do to magnets with that conventional mode of attachment? Some of them are rotated. These ones, something else is done, but you're not changing the mode of attachment. Can we move forward to paragraph 206, which is under a section that considers Zimmerling's disclosure? And this really is mirroring a little bit what we've just been looking at in 196. We see the judge identifying what he says the two solutions to the problems of a cochlear implant suggested by Zimmerling are. And of course, what we've just been on, my lord, is that there's more to it than that, but the two that he's picked out, one is a magnetic switch functioning in response to an external magnetic field, and the second is the most general thing. it's said to be that the implant magnets can rotate to align with the external magnetic field. They can. And as I've already foreshadowed, that's actually also the problem. The tendency to want to do that is in fact the problem as well. And that is a distillation that strips the rotation that we actually see in Zimmerling from its context and technical purpose. It's really important.
Sorry, what's wrong with it?
It strips what we see in Zimmerling from the context of what we see in Zimmerling and the technical purpose. It simply says implant magnets can rotate.
Suppose the judge had inserted the word temporarily before the word rotate. Could you criticise him?
I would still criticise him. It's not as bad, but the reason I would criticise him is that one of the really important things that have been stripped out here is the maintenance of the conventional mode of attachment, so that what you're rotating from is the conventional problematic perpendicular orientation. So the mode of attachment of everything in Zimmerling has the single dipole facing out perpendicularly from the side of the head.
I don't quite understand that submission, because here he's trying to epitomise the advances disclosed in Zimmerling, the solutions, to use his word, whereas your own submission is that the mode of attachment in Zimmerling is conventional. So why would he describe what's conventional when trying to epitomise what the advance is?
Right. Let me be absolutely clear about it. Because the advance is to facilitate, provide the ability to rotate a magnet from its conventional position when attaching away from that orientation when it needn't do so because the external component is taken away, but that then can return to that position so as to fulfill the same role, conventional role, in the attachment.
That seems to come back to the omission of the word temporarily.
Not just temporarily, because it's the rotation from that conventional position when it's attaching. So my Lord's absolutely right that temporarily is part of it, but it's not the whole of it. What you're not doing, you put it the other way round, my Lord, what you're not changing in Zimmerling is the way in which the magnets attach. You're not hinting at that, at changing that. You're accepting that that's how they have to attach. I need them to poke perpendicularly out, and I'm rotating them away temporarily when they don't have to attach because I've taken the external bit off and I put the
Okay, now at this point I can't resist the question that I've been suppressing for a while, which is when you talk about the way in which magnets attach, it's magnetic attraction.
Yep.
That's always the case.
No.
It's true in prior art, and it's true.
I meant something more specific than that it's magnetic attraction. I meant if you go to my skeleton and you look at paragraph 43, that diagram, where you see the external component in place, I meant left-hand side, single pole poking outwards, so you've got the perpendicular orientation of the magnetic dipole out of the head when attaching. That doesn't change in Zimmerling.
Yep. The only change is the orientation of the dipole. The fundamental principle of magnetic attraction is the same in both cases.
Oh, it's a magnet, yeah, absolutely. That
Yeah.
we'll have no argument on either side of the court about that. My lord's absolutely right about that. But so of course it's magnetic attraction, but what you have on the left-hand side of that diagram, figure 1, is a single pole presented to the outside of the head, attracting to another single pole, which if they're the same size means that they'll line up anyway, and they'll attach and hold. But what you have on the right-hand side, those are discs seen side on. So what you have on the right-hand side are both a north and a south pole presented on both of them, which means that you need to line up rotationally those discs so that they're in the right orientation with respect to each other. And when I keep saying it's not talking about, Zimmerling's not talking about the mode of attachment, what I'm
not talking about changing the dipole.
I'm talking about thinking that all I need is a single pole pointing out of the side of the head. That's how it's always been done. That's how I'm continuing to do it. And it's not hinting that what you actually do is get rid of that problematic orientation of the dipole and put it in the plane of the head where you've got a north and a south pole presented to the external component, which is the right-hand side, which is what the invention does.
Yep.
And that's really important, because what has happened in paragraph 206 is that context, the context in which you're doing it and the purpose for which you're doing it, to rotate it away from that conventional position temporarily, has been stripped out. The other thing that's been stripped out is how you achieve it. And to be clear, when you've got rotation, in Zimmerling, how you achieve it is by providing a shape that's suitable for rotation. The sphere or the circular thing, you change its shape from the conventional flat magnet. So the context of what you're doing, rotating away from the conventional direction, but you're keeping the conventional mode of attachment, left-hand side of that diagram, that's stripped out. The purpose, the temporary rotation away from that problematic orientation, that's stripped out, and how you achieve it by going to a shape that's suitable to be rotated, so it's got a thin rotational profile, whether it be a cylinder, a sphere, a rugby ball, whatever else you might want to do, that's stripped out.
So what do you say to the fact that Judge's paragraph 206 is in almost identical terms to your own expert's evidence, which is quoted by the respondents in their skeletal argument?
Well, I'm going to come to that.
Core bundle, tab 6,
yes.
page 60.
Well, I'll tell my lord now, I'm going to come to that, but what's really notable about that is the first limb of that is in those terms. Why has the language been changed? Almost exactly the same. It's not exactly the same, and it's been changed in a subtle way. What my expert did, and I will come to that, is introduce his 20-odd pages of the description of what's going on by saying that what Zimmerling describes are magnets that rotate. And of course he then goes on and describes the details of the magnets. And that's been subtly changed to simply the fact that magnets can rotate. Why has it been changed? Because actually the wording of my expert report wouldn't have done. you could see the first link is exactly, but it isn't in the second link. And it's one of those things where you've got to look quite carefully at subtle change in language. But it's being put like that.
So you criticise the judge for making the language track more closely what's actually in Zimmerman, is that right?
No, I don't criticise him for making it. What I say is the way it's been put there, how it precisely got in that form, whether it was my friend's submission, I don't know. But the way it's been put there is to focus on an ability, simply the fact that magnets in a magnetic field can rotate. The simple fact, rather than how you do it, how it's achieved and for what purpose, I criticise the judge for taking that as the solution, yes.
Okay.
The bottom line, my lord, is it does strip away context, purpose, and how it's achieved, as I've said. It strips away that everything in Zimmerling keeps the magnetic dipole of attachment, the conventional one. It strips away that the purpose of Zimmerling, where it has rotation, is to rotate away from that problematic arrangement when it doesn't need to be attaching, so temporarily. And it strips away that the way it does it is by paying attention to the shape to make it a shape that can rotate with a low rotational profile. It strips away all of that. And it's been done to give what we say is an artificial starting point. It's a partial picture, an artificial starting point, which at that level of generality can then just be said to be covering the invention as well.
I suspect that sort of submission means that all summaries are impossible. Whenever you try and summarise anything, someone will always pop up and say, oh, you've stripped away the context, you've taken out all the other things, and you'd have every paragraph being as long as the document is trying to describe.
No. With respect, my lord, I understand that that means that you have to, for instance, a judge might say, this doesn't matter or that doesn't matter. But with respect, when you're identifying a one-line solution that has gone to the extreme of excluding all of the context that I've referred to and the purpose and how it's achieved, that doesn't mean that if the judge had some better summary of it that had referred to the dipole.
But he has. I mean, if the only thing the judge said about Zimmerling was paragraph 206, then I'd understand the submission you're making. But that's transparently not what happened. I mean, this comes at the end of a whole series of pictures which show the very orientation that you say isn't in this judgment. What it is, it's there in figure 5A and figure 5B and in figure 4B. They're all in the judgment. Sure. Now, you're right, it's not written in words in 206, but why is that on its own a legitimate criticism?
I'll tell you, my lord, why. Because it's putting, it's not just a summary, it's saying this is a solution that's taught. It's identifying a piece of information or alleged teaching that it's then going to say would be taken on its own. We'll see how he deals with it.
Well, it may be later, but what I'm focusing on at the moment is the amount of effort you're putting into paragraph 206.
Well, let me put it this way, my lord, because it's the start of where you see what he's taking from Zimmerling and then porting across is at too high a level. And he's actually saying, he's expressing it as a kind of general solution at this level of abstraction. And that's why I'm putting the effort in at this point in the judgment. My lord's right in that I've got to then go on and show how it goes wrong and it gets imported later. But it really does start to go wrong here because he's identified an abstract thing that he's saying is the solution. In much the same way as those common general knowledge cases identify just an abstract thing in the common general knowledge without explaining the context in which it's usually used or whatever it may be. And that's perhaps another reason why I'm focusing on it, because it is, you can see that what's being identified is something at a very abstract level, which is then going to be used later, which is exactly what goes on in those common general knowledge cases. So I'm focusing on it to show, my lord, that it's the same thing going on. Can we pick up the judgment at para 212? Because I want to be fair to the judge, because there is a paragraph at 212 where, although he doesn't put it in the language that I put when I say it's the conventional attachment, the substance of what he's got here is talking about that. Let me explain why that's so. In 212, he notes that Zimmerling teaches the external magnets for attaching to the internal rotating one all have what he calls an axial magnetic orientation. And that is in substance saying that the mode of attachment is always the conventional one, with the magnetic dipole of the external and internal magnet being perpendicular to the side of the head. I hope, my lady and my lords, understand why I say that's in substance what he's pointing to there. So it's in substance identifying that the conventional arrangement of the dipole when in use is not being changed. And the judge puts it in terms of this being taught by Zimmerling, and then goes on in the second sentence to say it's not common ground that Zimmerling teaches this to be a requirement. And I want to just pause and make a point about the use of the taught language here, and also going on to ask the question, is it teaching that it's a requirement? Because in cases where something new is described, or even where something not new but simply a previously known feature, but that was not always part of the picture, is included, one can perfectly well understand thinking about a disclosure in terms of what is taught and whether that teaching includes suggesting the feature is a requirement. But here we are talking about the orientation of magnets when forming the attachment that's only ever been done in this conventional way. And so you have to treat it with a bit of care. And actually what I say is the judge is putting it in a way that betrays an idea that the skilled person would be considering doing something else unless taught they mustn't. That's what's going on there. They'd be considering doing something else unless it's suggesting you mustn't. But it's just incorporating and using the only thing that was ever done. And that's a point we make in paragraph 58 of our skeleton. The document is incorporating the only way attachments were ever achieved. What is it that would make the skilled person be thinking of doing something else? We say nothing. But that's the way the point is put in 212. It betrays a thinking that the skilled person would consider changing that unless the Zimmerling document positively teaches it's a requirement. And we drop down to 214, foot of the page, page 128. And here the judge really is getting into Zimmerling teaching you to change things. He's suggesting Zimmerling might teach changing the orientation of the dipole, doing it in a way that says it may not matter. That's what he's considering. The point is being put at the beginning of that paragraph quite generally, but he's obviously focusing on the cylinder because that's the only thing where one can conceivably talk about the shape in Zimmerling actually having an orientation of the magnetisation that's one thing or another. And you can see that that's what he's referring to in the last line of the paragraph. But why, we ask, why is the judge saying or even thinking about Zimmerling teaching changing the orientation of the dipole? One thing we know that it's not changing, in the sense that it's oriented in the same way perpendicularly out of the side of the head in use. What this seems to be driving at is changing in the sense of orientation relative to geometry of the shape of the magnet. But Zimmerling proposes shapes of magnets that hadn't been proposed before. They're mainly spheres, or spheres with bits cut out, and this cylinder. Why, we ask, is this being put in terms of changing the direction of magnetisation? Well, the answer is because that's the way my friend likes to put it. But it's wrong. I mean, why would you look at Zimmerling and say it's telling you to change something about the shape that had never been used before? One simply magnetises this new shaped magnet in the direction required for it to have the dipole perpendicular to the size of the head in the conventional attachment. And that's all the cross-examination over the top of the next page is directed to. You're not changing anything. And again, this is hindsight at play, my lady, my lords, because what my friend wants to do and what the judge does is take this idea of changing and then says, well, I won't change the magnet, I'll just change the dipole of the existing magnet. But one doesn't, if you're looking at Zimmerling, you don't think of it as notionally previously having the cylinder magnetised in a different way to start with and changing it. Nor is that cross-examination framed in terms of changing it. And my friend tries to support the judge in this regard in his skeleton at paragraphs 53 to 54. And what is notable here is he simply adopts the point that I'm attacking in his explanation, as if repeating it will make it true. He doesn't try to explain why one should be thinking in terms of changing. To be clear, my point is Zimmerling does not in any way put its disclosure as a direction to change magnetisation, either generally or of a particular shape. It simply tells you that with this new cylindrical shape, it tells you how to magnetise it. Make that good. If you look again in the supplementary bundle, so page 35, so I'm in Zimmerling now, line 6 through to about 13, we looked at this before. It's telling the reader how the cylinder is oriented physically and how it is magnetised normal to its axis and how it rotates. It's not in any way saying change the magnetisation from one orientation to another. And my friend deals with this in his skeleton by simply asserting in his paragraph 54, he says the judge was right to say Zimmerling explains that the orientation of the dipole may need to change. He doesn't even attempt to say where in Zimmerling the explanation is put in terms of changing. Zimmerling simply doesn't do it. In fact, insofar as Zimmerling makes reference to any comparison with anything from before, it points out that the orientation of the dipole in normal use is the typical one. That's line 11 of what we've just been looking at. So my submission is, again, it's hindsight at play in paragraph 214 of the judgment. There is no change to the direction of magnetisation of magnets specifically proposed by Zimmerling, because they hadn't been used before. But the argument is put like that because what is actually being thought of is to throw Zimmerling away, go back to the previously used dis magnet, and change the direction of magnetisation of that magnet relative to its geometry. That's why the language is being put like that. Zimmerling's not about change at all. It's about a new shape magnet.
Forgive me, does that point on change, I see the point you're making in 214, but the judge continues into 215 and talks about the same thing, and I don't think he's saying change there.
No, I'm going to come to 215 because 215 is a bit of a mess because the judge says he got that wrong as well.
Okay. Okay. Well, you'll come to it. That's
well, actually, I look down at my note and I see I'm coming to it now.
There you go.
This really is difficult because the judge himself says it's an error, and we need to look at it carefully. The first point that's made here is that the judge says that Zimmerling teaches how to arrange and rotate a variety of shapes of magnets in an external magnetic field such that they are arranged with their dipole across their axis of rotation and are trying to align to some extent to reduce the torque in an external magnetic field. If that first sentence really is referring to the axis of rotation, actual rotation, not some point about symmetry, it's no more than stating that what all magnets will do in a field if not already wholly aligned. As I explained earlier, it means the axis of rotation rather than the symmetry. That's just trite, it's the law of physics. The paragraph goes on with the sentence that says all the torque orientations other than spheres where it appears to depend have the axis of rotation perpendicular to the skin. Now, what I should draw attention to, although I don't know whether it's related to the same point, but the judge had earlier pointed out, this is his paragraph 208, that for a sphere, the definition of axial and diametric magnets doesn't really work. And I'm just drawing attention to that because he's excluding the sphere from what he's saying here, and I want to be fair to him, and it may be, but it's something to do with the point that he's identifying here. I don't think so, but he does exclude a sphere earlier on, and what he's referring to in that earlier paragraph, 208, is that for a sphere, the definition of axial and diametric magnets don't work because for a sphere, a diameter across a circumference is also an axis. So there it appears to be a point being made about geometry, as I understand it. When we come to 215, the judge is also excluding spheres from what he's saying in the second sentence. Although the help that I can give you as to what he's referring to is limited because it's completely opaque in my submission. Before I try on that, can I just make a point as an aside? Excluding spheres from all the orientations disclosed rather makes a mockery of referring to all the torque orientations, because other than the many embodiments with spheres, there's in fact just one. The figure 9 cylinder. So the phrase all the torque orientations says for spheres actually just means the cylinder. Turning to what it is that these orientations say for spheres are said to have, as written, the judge says an axis of rotation perpendicular to the skin. That's obviously wrong, and it's common ground, and the judge himself said it's wrong at the form of order hearing. I'll give my lady and my lords a reference. It's page 100 of the transcript, which is behind tab 28 of the supplemental bundle. It's page 273 of that bundle, down to about line 14. And what he says is, it obviously meant to say a dipole perpendicular to the skin, rather than axis of rotation to the skin. And of course, in Zimmerling, as I've been emphasising, in use, they all have a dipole perpendicular to the skin, directly out the side of the head. So it's true the cylinder does have that when in use, although not when it rotates away when you're in the MRI. The trouble with the judge's explanation is it's obviously true for the spheres too. It's obviously true that the spheres all have a dipole perpendicular to the skin when in use, just like the cylinder. So the sentence becomes a different nonsense. Why is the judge excluding spheres when he now says he was referring, what he now says he was referring to is true of spheres? And my friend attempts to defend this paragraph at paragraph 55 of his skeleton, and I'll do my best to address what my friend is saying, although it's not so easy. He says all the judge is doing is recording the evidence, which he says was to a particular effect. And the judge didn't refer to any evidence, either in the judgment nor when he gave his explanation at page 100 of the transcript. And it's difficult to understand what it is my friend is saying the evidence was, because I think with respect to my friend, something's gone wrong with his sentence. As it reads, it says all the judge is recording here is evidence that the dipole of a sphere will rotate to depend on external magnetic field that is applied to it. And it's not made any easier if one looks at the reference given to Professor Parker's second report, which is the footnote there. That's not really on point at all, and it certainly doesn't identify a point that's true for cylinders but not spheres, or not necessarily true for spheres. And that's what one would need to have for this sentence to make any sense at all. I'm afraid this is a complete muddle, and as we said in our skeleton, just inexplicable. And other than pointing out that it doesn't make any sense at all, I'm not in a position to assist my lady and my lords more with what he might have been referring to. It's accepted to be wrong as drafted, but the explanation now given can't be right either. Can I turn to address the Pozzoli analysis that the judge undertook? It starts at para 216 of the judgment, and we can pick it up where the judge identifies the differences of the patent over Zimmerling. He identifies that Zimmerling doesn't disclose use of rotatable diametric implant magnets in the plane of the coil housing with a magnetic dipole parallel to the implant coil housing. He also identifies the external magnet with that orientation is not disclosed. And that's basically its partner on the external component. And let me just make a point about this. He's actually identifying that Zimmerling doesn't teach any of the key details masses in the pattern. The idea of changing so as to move the dipole away from the problematic perpendicular orientation, so as to lie in the plane of the head and correspond with an external magnet, so that the mode of attachment changes to the right-hand side of the diagram in my skeleton. He identifies the difference. He then moves to consider a series of diagrams provided by my learned friend. He says to explain a geometry point. And you see at 221 a series of 3 diagrams, which starts with a representation of the cylinder in Zimmerling. This is paragraph 221. And it shows the cylinder, although not its soft magnetic cap, the figure 9 embodiment. The next diagram shows a salami slice of that cylinder, and then the third shows it flipped, so it's lying parallel to the skin. And the point of this is really rather difficult to understand, because the judge expressly says, this is the text in parentheses starting in the 3rd line of para 221, it's to demonstrate what he calls the geometry point, not acceptance that the skilled person actually thinks of this. As we pointed out in our skeleton at para 64, it's completely opaque. The judge never identifies what the geometry point is. And my submission to my lady, my lords, is it looks suspiciously like a step-by-step route to the invention, although said not to be how the skilled person thinks. And I was expecting my friends to have enlightened us in their skeleton as to how they say this is legitimate, or what the judge was doing. But there's notable the absence of any attempt to explain what they say the judge was doing there. Now, having done that, the judge breaks off at 223 before addressing the 4th head of Posoli to deal with a point on a criticism of Professor Parker that needn't detain us. At the bottom of that page, that's what he moves on to look at. He returns to deal with the 4th head of Posoli from 239 onwards. And the most important paragraph is, well, the key paragraphs are 242 to 246. Perhaps the most important point in 242 is sub-para C, as we explain in our skeleton at para 67. And what's being addressed here is the idea of keeping the magnet as the common general knowledge disc shape. And it's implicit, I think, here that it's to remain positioned parallel to the skin as before too. And the point, as I understand it, is to change the way it's magnetised. So this is where the change comes back in. So moving from the arrangement on the left-hand side of our diagram at para 44 to the right-hand side. And the key point in this paragraph is the suggestion that, quotes, this type of rotation was taught by Zimmerling. And indeed saying that Professor Swanning had accepted that. 2 points to make about this. First, the type of rotation we have in Zimmerling is, as I've repeatedly emphasised, in context, it's the temporary rotation of the dipole from its in-use orientation perpendicular to the side of the head. Zimmerling doesn't teach this type of rotation when one looks at it properly in context. It's only at a very high level when one ignores context and technical purpose. That way of abstracting it in 206, that a magnet can rotate in an external field. If one abstracts it like that, then this type of rotation is taught in Zimmerling, but that's because that is all rotation of magnets in magnetic fields. It's only at that very high level where one ignores context and technical purpose in Zimmerling that one can say this type of rotation is taught. It doesn't really make sense to talk about it as a type then, because it really is basically any rotation of a magnet in a magnetic field. And the second point is the suggestion that the cross-examination of my expert showed him accepting it. Now, as far as we can make out, that must be a reference to the cross-examination he identified earlier in 214, which is at the top of page 129. And that doesn't do the job of identifying a type of rotation, as I've already touched on. All that does in the context of a cylinder is identify that for a cylinder to rotate, which remember in Zimmerling it's rotating away from perpendicular to the side of the head in its ordinary position, one magnetises the cylinder perpendicular to the axis of rotation. But again, that is just the definition of the physical law. The axis of rotation of a magnet is perpendicular to the dipole, because the torque is the vector cross product. So what's happening is that a very high level abstraction solution is being identified earlier and then being said to have been taught. So this to be something that you'd actually use in a totally different context when one gets to this part of the judgment. It's worth separately picking up on one of the other points the judge made in paragraph 242, and that's subparagraph A, addressing the point we make about how this approach to Zimmerling eschews all the specific embodiments. And this is a point, as I've already said to my lady and my lords, I maintain in this court, and I particularly draw attention to the fact that if one is stripping out context and technical purpose to isolate a feature or an item to be devoid of them, you're very likely to have to resort to this case of ignoring all the specifically taught embodiments. It should be a big red flag. And the judge says he wasn't ignoring the embodiments specifically taught. Says they are being considered, subparagraph 1. And with respect, that's not really meeting our point. To say they're considered but the skilled person decides not to use any of them, even as a starting point, isn't meeting the thrust of our point. That none of them are chosen either to implement or as a starting point even for an obvious modification. And what's actually implicit in this is, again, the suggestion that the skilled person would not see as part of Zimmerling the features that I say are common to all of those embodiments that I've emphasised, that have been stripped out. The maintenance of the magnetic dipole perpendicular to the side of the head, the purpose of achieving a rotation away from that orientation temporarily, and the way in which that is done by modifying shape to one which can accommodate that temporary rotation. These are the key things avoided or excluded from the full picture by not starting from any embodiment. They're part and parcel of every embodiment, but they're jettisoned by taking this higher abstraction of what the judge says is the solution. My lady and my lords will see that the crunch comes in paragraph 246. I'm in the judgment, where the judge identifies what he says is the critical dispute. He says the point is whether a skilled person reading Zimmerling would think of using the common general knowledge cochlear implant disc-shaped magnet and then, note the word then, to flip the dipole from axial to diametric. That, as we point out at paragraph 69 of our skeleton, does encapsulate my learned friend's case. Please note that then, though, because the first step is to decide to use a common general knowledge magnet, and then after that, the next is to decide to flip its direction of magnetisation. Just pause and think about that. The first step, the decision to have a common general knowledge disc magnet, is actually a decision to throw away Zimmerling as regards rotatable magnets. As I keep emphasising to my lady, my lords, and as is common ground, the basic law of physics that any magnet not already aligned with an external field would tend to rotate to do so. And what Zimmerling teaches is to avoid the problem of the torque, with the common general knowledge disc magnet, one should adopt a magnet of a shape that will allow rotation, so as to temporarily rotate the direction of that dipole away from the one that it takes in attachment. Zimmerling is proposing changing the shape, and the first step as to how to get there is to decide not to. Deciding to keep the common general knowledge magnet is to throw away Zimmerling. And to go back to Zimmerling's starting point, and my lady, my lords, a point we make in paragraph 70 of our skeleton is particularly striking. We say the second step in the case, having decided to use the common general knowledge disc magnet, the second stage is to decide to, quotes, flip the dipole. That is, permanently move the dipole so it's not in the perpendicular direction to the head when in use. Change the mode of attachment. But what that does is to move it so it never needs to be rotated away from the problematic perpendicular direction. Brings with it an issue of rotational alignment with north and south poles, for instance. But it eliminates the need to temporarily rotate away at all. You've changed the way in which the attachment takes place. Can I just pause and take stock of where we say we've got to? What we have with the invention is a different way to look at the problem. Instead of sticking with the well-known method of magnetic attachment, and I mean more than simply that it is a magnet, my lord, I mean what we show in the left-hand side. Instead of sticking with that, with one single pole on the implant directed outwards to the other single pole on the external part. So you have a dipole directed perpendicularly out the side of the head, which requires the magnet to be reshaped so as to be capable of accommodating a temporary rotation away. The invention avoids that by proposing a different orientation of the dipole in the plane of the housing. And the problem with the judge's approach to Zimmerling, and what is or is not obvious over it, is that, as I say, he's distilled far too general a point from Zimmerling. Zimmerling is certainly about magnets that rotate in an external magnetic field. But to say the teaching to be taken from Zimmerling is simply the fact that implant magnets can rotate to align with an external magnetic field is to ignore all of Zimmerling's context and purpose. And is to ignore how the purpose is achieved. Specifically, it's to ignore that what's being achieved in Zimmerling is the ability to rotate from that conventional pole-to-pole mode of attachment temporarily away from it by adopting a differently shaped magnet to that previously used. Now, my learned friend says in his skeleton that we haven't identified any alleged error of principle. I hope you'll understand why we say that the approach has incorporated hindsight, both because it's incorporated too abstract a teaching said to be taken from Zimmerling, stripping out the context and technical purpose and the way it's achieved. And looking at Zimmerling to try to see or to distill from Zimmerling some kind of teaching about changing the magnetic dipole when it's just not there, that is an error of principle in my submission. And it is done, it is guided by hindsight. And what you've ended up with is basically the solution being identified as that high level effect of the physical law that a magnet can rotate in a magnetic field to align with it, which is actually the problem, causes the problem. According to the judge and my learned friends, it's the solution taught by Zimmerling. And at that level of generality, my friends say it's also a solution taught by the patent. It's all three. Problem, Zimmerling solution, patent solution. How can it be all three? Well, because it's too high a generalisation. Basically at the level of the law of physics. Now, I see the time. I'm actually making quite good progress, so I hope not to be, well, I won't be very long in the morning before I can hand over to my own friend. So I actually think the suggestion that my lady made is hopefully achievable. I looked rather aghast because my note was quite long and I thought we were going to spend more of the time on obviousness, but I have made quite a lot of progress.
Well, it does all depend on how long the parties think is going to be required for the infringement debate, because as you would appreciate, I originally estimated this appeal at 1 to 1.5 days when it was a validity appeal.
Sure.
Parties subsequently agreed 1.5 days in circumstances where there's not only an infringement issue, but also a second infringement issue which wasn't even considered by the judge below, so we don't even have a first instance judgment to work on.
No, my lord's right about that. The parties have spoken about how to move that forward, and we've agreed a way forward, which actually means, although you have to look at ordinary construction and equivalence twice over, you're really only looking at activist question 3.
Fine. I'm not saying it's unmanageable. All I'm saying is that one has to bear in mind that the infringement issues, if and when we get to them, will take a bit of time.
It will take a bit of time, and I'd anticipate it would take less time than moving to it at noon. But as I say, I think we're making.
Perhaps you can have a word with Mr. Nicodopoulos overnight.
I will. We're making good progress.